Good morning, everybody. I hope you're well on this day where the weather seems to have changed. I don't know why, but we've gone from glorious sunshine to rainy and wet. Where I'm based in Hampshire, I hope it's a little bit better where you guys are. Thank you very much for your time today. This is a webinar put together by Altaro and ADM Computing. And as I say, from my standpoint, it's welcome. Just a little bit housekeeping rules. You can ask questions in the question box. I mean, we've all done webinars before, so hopefully it's not new to you. But you can ask questions. The guys from ADM will try and answer them. If not, what I'll do is I will answer them at the end. There's a question section, and we can go from there. So my name's Keith Jones. I'm a channel manager for Altaro Software, and helping me today is Isaac Ford Wilson from ADM. He's having a bit of a microphone problem, so he can't speak at the moment. So as soon as he gets that sorted out, we will get going. So without further ado, let's crack on. So when we do these sort of things, it's always quite handy to try and set a scene with regards to we ask a question with regards to what's the best practices for disaster recovery. But before that, you have to actually ask yourself, actually, what is disaster recovery, and what does disaster recovery get you? Now, the interesting thing is that there's a misconception within the marketplace that disaster recovery and business continuity are one of the same things. They're not. Business continuity is exactly what it says. It's about continuing your business in light of, for example, with what's going on at the moment in relation to something that's happened, and you just want to keep going forward. But there's no major changes that happen in the background. And what it is that there's a functionality change within the business, and there's a functionality difference that needs to go through. Disaster recovery is if it's exactly what it says. It is something that's happened that's quite major. Now, these come in many different guises. I mean, you look at the screen at the moment, and you'll see the fact that probably the biggest one that everybody knows about is human error. But behind that, there's unexpected updates and patches. We've all had updates and patches that have gone horribly wrong, down to power outages. I mean, in this country, power outages are probably less of a problem. The issue is the fact that quite often with power outages, it's to do with somebody digging up the road in front of the building, and they go through the mains power. And in a previous incarnation, I was doing a role, and that was exactly what happened to Volkswagen Financial Services. The company that were doing the roadworks in front of them were digging a hole. The power line was not where they thought it was, and they went through, and all the guy at Volkswagen said there was an almighty blue flash, and all the lights went out. Now, his option for that was he had a second data center that wasn't affected, so he just carried on. So that was his disaster recovery. But you know, they're part of a multi-billion-pound operation, and therefore that's just one example. But they come in many guises. I mean, they could be server room issues, there could be server room moves that go wrong. You know, so there could be flood, fire, theft. And as we alluded to, it's raining at the moment. So, you know, maybe if you're in a very low-lying area, especially during the winter period we had where there was so much rain, you know, that disasters come in many guises, and you need to understand that but they are very different to business continuity. When it comes to disaster recovery, there's effectively two mechanisms for measuring what you need to look at when it comes to disaster recovery. There's what's called RPOs and there's RTOs. Now, we use this quite extensively in the backup sphere, but it's also used within the disaster recovery sphere, and and effectively it's how far back can you afford to lose the data, and how quickly do you need that data back? Now, the closer you get to the central failure point, as in I want to lose the least amount of data, and I want it back as fast as possible, is the most expensive. And then it will spread out at that point between the two from either side. And then as you go away from the failure point, it will cost you less to actually do that. But behind that, you need to have a number of metrics that you need to understand that will go through from the business. So the first one being is that you need to understand how much data is going to grow. So if we put it in the context of, say, of a disaster recovery context, and backup is your disaster recovery platform, the biggest thing you need to understand is that you need to understand what type of data you've got, how much it's growing by, and how important, because not all data is equal. So you can have something that's on an archive file that's a lot less sensitive data wise than something that's on an SQL database that's theoretically running the business. Or if you're a school, it could be Sims, or it could be this, or it could be that. There's various different platforms and mechanisms that you need to look at. But at the end of the day, not all data is equal, and therefore you need to understand what you want from your data and what your data is going to give you. So there's a step back where you need to look at the processes and look at what you own and what you're doing. At the end of the day, if you've got somebody with a personal share on the system, it's just full of their home photos. That's not important to the business. They shouldn't have it on there, but the likelihood is they probably do. But at the end of the day, it's a case of making sure that they understand that this data is not significant to the organisation, and this data needs to be pulled from it. Otherwise, it's not going to be backed up. But as I say, likewise, then you've got critical data as the business, and it could be the account system. The next thing you've just got to keep in mind is that simplicity is your friend. At the end of the day, the more complicated you make a process, and disaster recovery is one of those. At the end of the day, if you make it so convoluted with that, when you do have a disaster, you spend more time trying to deal with the systems that you put in place or the processes that you put in place, and actually getting the system up and running and available. It's kind of defeating the object of the game. At the end of the day, if you keep everything absolutely as simple as possible, it really will drive and generate ease for you as an individual. Because if you think about it, at the end of the day, when you've got a disaster, or you've got a change of business, like we have at the moment, if you make the processes so complicated, you just end up sort of dealing with them. You won't end up driving anything further forward than what you want to do. So just make sure that you keep everything absolutely simple, and the more simple you can make it, the better it's going to be. And then the next stage you've got to keep in consideration is the support. So at the end of the day, when disaster strikes, or when a massive change strikes to your business, at the end of the day, you are not an island, right? You're not going to be left on your own, because you have these products that are there to help you, and you have the process and understanding of the processes that need to do it. So you need support from not only from your supplier, which in this case would probably be ADM, but you'd also need support from the vendors, and you need to make sure that the suppliers and the vendors are working together hand in hand. And there's an understanding that when you have a problem, the fact is what you don't need to be doing is going through many gatekeepers, for example, to get the answers to your problem, because you don't have time to wait for that gatekeeper to to follow the SLA rules. And the SLA rules could be that we're going to respond within the first hour of you recording a problem. That's fine, but if you look at a lot of vendors these days, that problem is the fact that that's just an automated email that ticks a box. It could be that you may not get an answer back from that vendor, or even that supplier, for 8, 12, 14, 24 hours. But at the end of the day, that's, if you take that at the minimum of what I stated there, 8 hours, that's 8 hours you're having to wait to get the answers you want. Well, behind that, you've got a business that is not functioning and not moving forward. And what's probably the biggest thing to think about is you're not actually getting a response from the vendor. Therefore, you can't give a response to the business, which means there's more pressure gets heaped on you to move it forward. And then as more pressure gets heaped on you, it then becomes more and more problematic. So you've just got to make sure that you understand that behind that is that it's not just about the product, it's about the support. And in amongst that, then it's how much the support costs you and the rest of it, and what you get, what bang you get for your buck. And then the last one you really need to sort of second to last, you need to sort of have consideration is where's the business going to go? If you looked at your business 5 years ago, what data was mission critical to your business 5 years ago is probably not what's critical to your business now. Or the quantity has grown dramatically, and therefore it changes the dynamic. And this goes back to this couple of slides ago, when you need to understand what data types you've got and how important those data types are. But then you've got to understand how they're going to grow going forward, because at the end of the day, data now comes as from a business standpoint like a tsunami, and it just constantly grows and grows and grows. And if you don't, as a business, understand what your future requirements are, you're not going to understand it. At the end of the day, you need to understand where your business is going. So you need to take a proof point now to say, okay, this is where I am today. This is where I was last year, and this is where I was 5 years ago from the business standpoint. And then from now, I can extrapolate the fact that I'm going to go from A to C, and I might go from A to C to X in the next 5 years. And I need to make sure that the systems are robust enough to deal with that and move it forward. Because if they don't, what will happen is that what's fit for purpose now, as a from a business standpoint and a business and a disaster recovery standpoint, will not be fit for purpose in 2 years or 3 years time. So therefore, if you don't look at it from a disaster recovery standpoint, and take the historical trends and then push that forward, you're going to be in a situation where it may or may not go. And then at the end of the day, you've got to understand how much you're going to pay. Unless you work for sort of the top 20 companies in the world at the moment, you don't have a limited budget. You don't have unbelievable things that can and can't you can and can't buy. We all have to work within budgetary constraints. We have to understand. Now, the interesting thing is that when you're looking at budget, if you understand where your data is growing and where your data is moving to, you can actually budget to deal with that data growth. But if you don't understand how your data is going to grow, you can't budget for it because you don't know. And likewise, if you don't understand what data types, because if you're growing just a load of erroneous data, you don't want to do that. So you don't want to put budget into something that's actually not required. So it's best practices that you have to do. And the great thing is the guys at ADM will help you with that one, and they'll do the studies, and you sort of look at your data types that you may or may not need. So when we're looking at disaster recoveries, you can sort of break it down into a number of different things. Now we effectively break it down into cold, warm, and hot sites, but there are a few other levels that go through. So if we look at disaster recovery planning, that'll sort of give you an idea about where you need to go. So believe it or not, there are still people out there that absolutely don't have a plan. Right? They don't think about it until the brown stuff hits the spinning thing. And at that point, what they do is they start blaming everybody else, and then they move forward from there. If you don't have a disaster recovery plan, right, and you don't understand how your business is going to be impacted, at the end of the day, your business is going to disappear. Your business is going to be lost. You have to understand, and part of the responsibility of being an IT manager is understand what goes through and what drives the business forward, and how it works from that point onwards. So, there are people out there with no plan. If you don't have a plan, you need to get a plan put together. And it could be just a very, very simple plan. And the first one is that, I don't have a plan, but what I do have is a really good backup system, and I really have good procedures that run around it. So what I would say is that just having a backup is fine. That'll give you the element of a disaster recovery, and it'll give you your first stages. So when we hit this situation where I may need to restore data, I may need to move data around because I've got a change of circumstances, that's fine. The thing is that what a lot of people forget to do is they've got to test: are the backups working? Are the processors doing what they need to do? Can I get a recovery from them? Have we got fault tolerances built into the systems? Have we got RAID on the disks? The basic stuff that you don't think, because at the end of the day is that you could quite often, especially for small organisations, go, oh, I need some more storage. You'll go out and buy maybe a small NAS box or something like that, and then you just set it up as JBOD, which is fine. But if you lose a disk, at the end of the day, it's not going to move it forward. So have you set it up so it's got RAID? So if I lose a disk, that's fine. The other thing is that are you buying your discs in batches? At the end of the day, normally what will happen is a batch of discs will fail as opposed to an individual disc that will fail. And the problem you have these days is that we're still dependent on spinning media or SSD. And I hate to say this, IT, it can be a fickle animal. We've all gone through this. It was working yesterday. I don't know what's gone wrong. I've done nothing differently. It just doesn't want to work today. We've all gone through that, and that's the beginnings of your disaster recovery. Because at that point, something's gone wrong. You've effectively have a disaster that started, and you've got people shouting at you. So you need to make sure that you understand it, and you understand the layers of protection and that you can require from the business. So you can also have a disaster recovery plan with no resources in place. If you understand what goes on in your business and you understand that in the event of X happening or Y happening, this is what you'll move to do. This is what's going to happen. This is what you'll do. Then that's fine. That could be the fact that, and I'll cover this in a second. You could be running a hybrid model, and a hybrid model will make sure that you. So bear with me a second. Teams. So a hybrid model will mean that maybe you're storing it in the cloud environment. But then what happens if your front end functionality, so the gateways that you have into the business fails? What happens this? So there are places at times where you don't have resources, but because you're leveraging against cloud infrastructure or hybrid infrastructure. But then behind that, you still need to make sure you've got a plan in place, and you've still got to have the. You don't need the resources. What you need is you need to understand the procedures and the plans that will drive it forward from there. And then you start moving on to what you need to do. So the first one is that I have an infrastructure in place. I have a traditional IT infrastructure. I back up locally. I've got all the procedures in place. Disaster strikes. I need to make sure, or from a compliancy standpoint, from insurance companies or bits and pieces, is that data offsite and in a place that's secure and in a secure location. So that secure location could be, as we've alluded to, cloud-based storage, or it could be into a supplier's data center. So, for example, ADM have the ability to do that for you. So what it means is that you've answered the question is that I've got everything on site. I do everything as I need to do. I have a process that goes through. But if I have a catastrophic failure, so for example, I have disk errors and it takes out all of my disks for whatever reason, or I have a chassis failure and all my data gets corrupted, or I have a virus attack. There's various different scenarios where I get a ransomware attack and stuff of this sort of nature. That happens in the wider framework of life. You have a plan where you can say, okay, that's not a problem. I have the data in a secondary repository, and then I can look at it from that standpoint. What we'll do is we'll go into this about how we can help you do this. But at the end of the day, if you have a procedure and you have a plan in place about what ifs and you thought it through, you can go back to the business and say, it's not a problem. We've lost this data for whatever reason. But I do have a secondary copy of the data. I'm going to have to pull it back, but I have a plan. Here's my plan. This is what it's going to do. It's going to take me X amount of time to do this. I have the support from a local supplier and the vendors to do this and help drive this back. And we will get this back in a seamless manner and get ourselves up and running in a timely manner. And you're doing this in a cost-effective mechanism that will sort of drive it through. The second option is then what's called a split site. So what this means is that you have the ability, like you would with the cold site, but then with the split site, you have the ability to fire up the infrastructure on an ad hoc basis. What this means is that you're leveraging against the supplier's infrastructure behind. So you're sending the data to their site. They're not doing anything with it. It's just sitting in a repository like you would in the cold site. But then, in the event of something happened, for whatever reason, you could fire that data up with some actions that need to happen. Now, that may take you a few hours to do. It could be that the fact that you're up within 24 hours and you can drive it forward. But what it allows you to do is have that data available within a set time frame. So you can move it forward and say, hey, look, we can do this in the next 24 hours because we can get the virtual machines fired up and we can get everybody hooked in remotely, and then everybody goes from there. So what it allows you to do is have that. But again, you've got that planned. You can say to the business, here is my procedure of what happens in the event of this happening. And you need to think it through as a team and go through this is the likelihoods of what's going to potentially happen to our business. That go through there. I mean, it could be that your data center is right next to a wall, and if you run a transport company, somebody forgets to put the brake on a truck and it runs through the wall of the building. We've all come across some of the weirdest things that have happened, but you then have a time scale to get you up and running and move forward. And then the next one is, as I said, is probably the biggest one, which is a hot site. Now, what we mean by a hot site is the fact that you have the ability to either very quickly from a manual standpoint or an automated system where you can actually fail to a secondary site. Now, that secondary site could be within your company. So it could be with, as I mentioned before, Volkswagen, for example, they had two data centers, one in one building, one in another in Milton Keynes. And what they did is they could automatically fail between the two, and it would carry up and running, and then the data sets would follow through. If you've got the financial clout to do that, then that's fine. That's a great way of doing it because that gives you the absolute resilience. It gives you scalability. In the event of a problem where you need more horsepower for whatever reason, you can pull it through, especially if you've got things like more remote workers and you've got to put connectivity into them. That gives you do. But that's quite an expensive route to do, and you need a lot of skilled staff to maintain and manage that, and there's a cost burden to it. Or you have the ability to do that into the supplier site. So you could look at pulling it straight into the supplier site, and then they would automatically fire it up on your behalf. And then you could then remote into their infrastructure through using their connectivity in the event of a disaster happening that way. So there's various different levels you need to do, but again, most of it is behind is that you need to understand what data you've got, where your data is growing, and how you're moving it forward from there, and then going at that point. So what you end up doing is that you need to understand the protection that's right for you, and then once you understand the protection is, then you determine what your disaster recovery plan is. Once you've got your plan, then you can look at the products to do it. But behind that, you've got to look at you've got to analyze your system. You've got to understand your data requirements. You've got to understand it. But behind that, you've got to make sure that you can ask for the bells and whistles. But if it's not going to give what you need, it's not going to happen. Now, what it does move is what we are moving into, though, as I alluded to right at the start, is we're moving to an evolution. And the evolution is the fact that we're going from traditional IT to a blended mix of some cloud services and some physical. What you'll end up with, and what everybody talks about, is the future, a hybrid infrastructure that we're moving to. So it depends where you are on the timescales, but you could be at the traditional IT, so all your infrastructure is in there. You could be in an evolving state, and so it could be the future. The interesting thing is what's driving the hybrid infrastructure is software as a service. So the fact is that we're all dealing with software as a service, and it could be networking pieces. And again, it's been forced upon us, and at the moment, the whole drive with people working from home is driving it to software as a service because it's the easiest way of deploying in the current times infrastructure and the way we drive it forward. And probably the biggest driver to this is going to be Office 365. We've seen the adverts with Teams. We've seen the fact that we're now doing a lot more collaborative stuff, and we're driving it forward from there. So it's changing the nature of IT, and it's changing the fact we do it. But what it's doing is it is forcing us to this hybrid model. You could call it hybrid cloud. You could call it anything you really like. But at the end of the day, it is that blend of public cloud, private, your own infrastructure, software as a service, which comes under private cloud. There's various different ethoses behind it. So when you're looking at disaster recovery, What software as a service does, it changes the paradigm of what disaster recovery is, because the rules change in relation to who owns the data and who does what with the data. And if you take 365 as a classic example of this, um, one of the paradigms that's changing is the fact that emails and documents are now stored outside of the company control. See, historically, you would have stored it on a share within your company that you would have backed up and would have been part and parcel of your disaster recovery plan. Now it could be stored on OneDrive or SharePoint. Well, that's now outside of the control of the business because it's now in control of the individual. Because the individual is now the guy that decides where he shares it to and who he shares it with. But more importantly, when you're planning for your part of the parcel that you're looking for your disaster recovery is I've lost a file or I've lost a document or I've lost a contract. Well, if it's on your main infrastructure, you've got control because you're managing the disaster recovery process for losing that important piece of information. When you go to software as a service, actually that control then is the individual. So the individual is deleting it and destroying it. Now, they may be doing it by accident. They could be doing it maliciously. But at the end of the day, you've got to make sure that you understand that it goes through. And what's driving now? What doesn't help is that there's a misconception that software as a service is safe. Well, no, it's not. At the end of the day, it's just somebody else's compute. And what you have to understand is, what most people don't realize is the fact that Office 365, as it's the driver towards your hybrid infrastructure, is the driver and is now more business critical data is now part of it. So therefore, it's a bigger part of your disaster recovery plan. If it's not safe and it's not backed up, it's got to be included in as part of your disaster recovery plan. Because if you don't include it as part of your disaster recovery plan, it's going to be absolutely painful. So what needs to happen is that you need to understand that Microsoft caused the confusion themselves, because what they do is they tell everybody that they back the data up. No, they don't. What they do is that they have the data in a couple of locations. They don't back it up. If a user deletes it and then deletes his delete box, that data's gone. They will try their best to get it back. But if your disaster recovery plan says that you need to have your data back within a set period of time, so it's 24 hours, well, Microsoft can take up to 30 days. Well, that's then outside of your procedures and your plan that you put in place. So you don't understand, the company won't understand the fact that you can't get it back because you're relying off a major brand. The other thing that they'll also push through is the fact that they say the responsibility for the data is yours. But they cause that confusion themselves. But again, the guys that will sort of drive that through. The other thing that 365 as part of your hybrid infrastructure is causing is the fact that, as we said, uh, more and more work is done on a collaborative basis, and therefore you've got to look at the governance of who has responsibility to do what, where, when, and how. So you need to start looking at workflows and data archiving and bits and pieces of that sort of nature. At the end of the day, if you don't look at that and having the ability to do granular recovery and the security and the governance, it's your responsibility as a business. You think Microsoft would take ownership of it? Don't. It's actually you. You're buying a service. It's for you to manage the service. It's effectively like leasing a car. At the end of the day, it's not the car company's fault if you crash the car. It's your fault. You need to have insurance to make sure that that if you do crash the car, it's going to get fixed and get up and running again. And then the last part of this is the governances. The problem we have is that the layers 365, because it can go onto phones and tablets, and we're now getting people to work remotely, and therefore in some instances we're getting them to put 365 on their home machines. What's now happening is that there's now a merging of corporate and personal data. Now that's fine. If you have robust procedures in place to do that, that's what needs to happen. What I would say though is that the problem you have is that you open yourself up to things like GDPR rules. Now, it becomes a very, very grey area at this point, because GDPR is for personal not professional, but it's about the rules that are held on systems, about personal, so it becomes very, very grey. So you need to understand that if people are putting personal stuff because it's on a home machine and therefore it may or may not get blended into the corporate environment, or it's on their phones, but you need to pull it forward from there. What is the impact of the business? Because we've had one case where a client that we were dealing with was looking to put Office 365 backup in place. They didn't do that because they were merging with another company. What happened is that the sales team from the company that we were talking to quit. Well, actually was fired. Well, was made redundant. Is the correct terminology. But what they did before they left is they deleted absolutely everything. So they deleted their SharePoint files and their OneDrive files, as well as their email boxes and everything. The company didn't have it backed up. Microsoft couldn't recover it because they hadn't, because of the merger. It had taken a little bit of time to go through the process, and it had purged out their systems. What that meant is they lost an awful lot of contracts, and that were kept there. Now, when they went back to the sales staff to ask them why they'd done it, the reason was their rationale was we had a blend of personal data, and therefore we didn't want the company to have that personal data, so therefore we deleted it. And because we didn't have the mechanism to scan and delete individual items, we deleted everything. Realities are they were probably just rather upset with the whole situation and teach them a lesson. But the governances were the fact that there's been a change of where the data had been stored. That therefore there was an assumption that it was stored on the central system that was covered by the disaster recovery protocols. That it wasn't, because it was in 365 and it wasn't covered. So therefore, as we move to this hybrid and we move to this remote working and we move to this whole change that we have, you need to make sure you take this into consideration. So just a quick bit about us and what we do. This won't take very long, and then I'll go into how systems can look for the cold split and the hot sites. So everything that Altaro does is based on simplicity. It's done on outstanding support. We market very differently, so we'll do things like webinars. If you go onto our website, you can look at tutorials. We have a lot of ebooks that are not related to us as a product, but also to best practices. It could be around vSAN, it could be around .NET. So there's a lot of educational stuff. They're in our dojos, and if you'd like to take an opportunity to have a look at it, you can go to altaro.com and they'll push it through from there. We don't take any business direct. It'll all go through the likes of ADM, so we make sure that there's a centralized pool of local resource that really know our product and really is empowered to help you and drive it forward. And with us, we're looking at, we protect the server stack, both for physical and for virtual, and we do Office 365. What you will see coming out in the next few weeks is endpoint as well. So we will be adding additional products, and we're constantly adding innovations and refinements to the product set all the time. But behind that is the support organization. And what I said, one of the things that is key to looking at disaster recovery planning is support. We run 24/7 support. We don't run gatekeepers. We just run a whole system where you can go into our product, into chat, and you can talk to us directly. You'll talk straight to an engineer. Likewise, you can go straight to ADM. You can talk to a fully trained engineer, and they'll do the same. So we've mitigated out the gatekeepers, the SLA requirements, because at the moment we're on chat, I think we're answering in about between 12 and 15 seconds, and so you go straight through to an engineer. So let's make an assumption that you've got backup. Your backup's in place. Make an assumption it's with us, and you back up to local primary disk. That's fine. So that would give you your beginnings of, I have a disaster recovery plan. It's based around a good backup procedure, and this is what we do. I now need to consider moving forward. So what we can now look at doing is that if you want to move forward to a cold site because you've identified you need the data off site, we can now look at adding into an off-site cloud storage-based solution. So what this allows you to do is saying, okay, that's fine. I can move that into Azure. So we still back up locally. So we've still got the value adds of quick and fast recovery, but now we've got the data in Azure. So we can now go to the business that if our site for whatever reason goes down, I've got the data in a secondary location. It's managed. I can pull it back at any given time and point. It's pre-built in the software, and it's very, very easy. So that's very, very simple. Uh, you could then look at doing a split site. So, for example, you could have a secondary data center. Now, this could either be in your organization, or it could be hosted uh, inside ADM or whoever, but ADM would always be our preferred choice. You need to make sure that uh, you have the ability to do that. The great thing is that now that gives you the instantly to instantly boot up the backups in your data center. You've got acceleration. You can boot the backups. You've got it encrypted between the two sites, and you can move it forward. So suddenly you have the ability to now say, right, I've got a mid-level disaster recovery option that in the event of my primary site going down, my secondary will take over. My secondary can be anywhere in the world. My secondary can take over, and then I can actually get everybody plugged into that and moved forward. So the great thing is you can sort of try look at driving that forward and then say, look, I've got this ability to do this. I can either do it as a replicated copy, or I can do it as a backed up copy and just send it through and just do it that way. The choices are there, but again, your business your disaster recovery stroke business continuity plan will tell you what's needed for the business, and then you can then move it forward and then drive it through from that stage. So the great thing is that the tools are available for you. It's just a case of how you implement it and do it. The other way you could do is if you're running. So we have a number of academic trusts, as an example. And what they do is that they'll have multiple schools. And what the multiple schools will do is that school A will back up to B, and then D will back up to C will back up to D. God, I don't even know my alphabet. And they do it in like a round robin. So each school is buddied. And then what they'll then do is, and they do a step further, and I'll come back to the second. But you could look at doing that, so you can actually have it so site A is to site B and replicate between the two. All you need is the resources just to handle it if a disaster happens for whatever reason. And likewise, if you've got multiple locations, you could go back to the centralized location that push it forward. Now, what happens is that with the academic trust, this is exactly what they do. They have site A replicating to site B, and then they'll push it back to a centralized location. So you can do that as much as you like. And at that point, what you can start doing is maybe you can then start billing that as interdepartmental billing to the company. So this could be a branch office in Toronto, this could be in LA, this could be in wherever. You could pull it all back to head office, and then you could build the departments back. So there's various different ways you can cut this, but again, it's about making sure that the data is in multiple locations and therefore the data is available. But the data is available on a quick and easy mechanism for doing that. And then, of course, you have the ultimate, which you have hot site. Now, what this allows you to do is that we have the ability to instantly fire up the backups if you have the resource in place. But what you'd also do at that point is that you go for complete belt and braces, and that you'd also replicate then into the Azure site. So you've not only have you now got from site A to site B, you've also got into Azure. So what the Academy Trust do is this will be school A, this is school B. Now, where in this example we show you going to Azure, they actually have another location which is their head office, and what they do is they send it into that third site, which is their headquarters in Swindon. So suddenly, school A and school B are replicating data amongst each other, and then there's the third option is then sending it into the school. Now that means that they've got the data in effectively three places. The downside for them is that it costs them more on disk because they're having to store the data from 32 schools. But at the end of the day, their line is that the data is more important than it is actually the cost of disk, because the cost of disk is going down. So therefore, we need to make sure that different options skin different things. So you have the ability to, as you can see here, to scale just from. You could start with just a decent backup solution, then maybe go to a cold site. Then when you've got a little bit more budget, you can go to a split site. Then you can start bringing in other parts of your business into the split site, and then you can go to hot site down the line as your infrastructure goes. You don't have to do it all in one hit. You can do it as a phased approach to the business and drive it through. And then, as I said, we have problems with he can't get his microphone to work. So let me just quickly, um, if you know ADM, you know the value that ADM bring. Um, and then it's a case of that they've got an awful lot of highly trained engineers. They've got a really good, extensive knowledge across multiple brands, whether that be Microsoft, Sophos, ourselves, right with VMware, and a whole plethora of other products that they will be able to offer you. They have all the engineers. For us, I mean, last I heard, I think they've got about 180 customers using our product. So they really do have a complete understanding about what they can and can't offer and what they do and don't do. So, with that in mind, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I know this is only supposed to take 45 minutes, and I know we're a little bit on time. Um, so let me just see if there's any questions that come through. So just one of the questions that I constantly get asked is just going back to the 365 as part of your hybrid IT infrastructure. Is that does Microsoft back it up? Microsoft have um, a terminology called shared responsibility, and what shared responsibility does is it effectively tells you the fact that they will take certain ownership, they will make their partner take ownership, but then there's ownership for you guys. So one of the key ones they go is people that can use the system. So it's user identity and authentication. That is your responsibility. Likewise, the data requirements and the data backup is your responsibility because it's your data. So therefore, you need to make sure that the data is and the responsibility is yours. And it is quite interesting that if you don't understand that and you go blindly thinking that the data they're backing up for you, then it doesn't sort of work on that front. So it's just something you just got to take into consideration is the fact that it's shared responsibility. And you need to look into it. Again, the guys at ADM will be able to explain that to you and actually go through from that standpoint. With remote workers, the interesting thing is that remote workers are exactly what they said. They're just the same workers. They're just connected to your network in a slightly different way because they're coming in via gateways or depending on how you set them up. Um, Remote workers still, at the end of the day, are still generating data. They're still utilizing your systems. What it is about the connectivity. And then this is why I added the bit about 365 into it, is because with the fact that we're doing more and more stuff on SharePoint and we're collaborating more remotely, if you don't put the rules and procedures in place about who can do what, where, when, and how, that's when you start losing data. You get data overridden. And if it's overwritten, there's not a lot you can do about it unless you've got a backup because you always go back to your last main state. Now, one of the things you can look at is litigation hold. And what litigation hold allows you to do is exactly what it says. It holds the last known state, so it allows you. It basically stops you deleting stuff. What it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't stop you. It doesn't look backwards. So, if, for example, you've deleted an email last week that had an attachment on it, litigation hold can't stop that because that's been deleted already. It can stop it going forward, but therefore it becomes an absolute problem for what's happened historically. This is what I'm saying is that part of your disaster recovery, and that would, deleting an email with an important attachment that could be a project spec for a new bid that you're doing for, that's quite an important consideration to do. So therefore, if you don't have the ability to roll it back, it's not going to do it. And litigation hold won't let you do that. The other thing about litigation hold is it's part of your e-discovery tools, which are normally encompassed in your higher licensing options, which cost you more money, and therefore, if you've got litigation hold, it costs you more money because it's about more storage. So it just has a whole panacea of problems. It won't get past the fact that if your disaster recovery plan says that you have to be able to recover documents back for the last 6 months or 12 months or 3 years, that can't do that for you at the end of the day, because it could be something that's historically done. Um, and likewise, so that does that. But at the end of the day, disaster recovery plans need to effectively morph with regards to the fact that IT infrastructure is going to change. We are going to go more towards this hybrid. We are going to do, Matt, and you have to have your plans understood. But behind that, you need to understand the fact that you need to understand where your data has come from and where it's going. You need to understand what the business requirements are and where the business is going, because that allows you to plan and then scale accordingly. So, with no more questions, I'd just like to say thank you very much. That's my email address there if you want to take a list. Isaac, as I said, had a bit of an issue with regards to, I don't know why he couldn't get on the system. It's cobblers in their shoes, I would imagine. But Isaac's email address is there. If not, just any of the guys at ADM will be there to be able to help you. If you need anything, though, please get in contact with us. This was designed today to be a discussion document to make you think. Hopefully, it's made you think, and maybe you can start looking at solutions that fit your business requirements once you know what your business requirements are. So, with that, say thank you very much. I hope you have a lovely day, and look forward to talking soon. Thank you.